First of all, I'd like to add my own voice to the expressions of some of the other speakers here today about just our astonishment about how fast 30 years have gone by. It's just incredible. It seems like the events of 1989 just happened yesterday, quite literally. First, some personal reminiscences of myself. The fall of 1989 for me was a very momentous time personally. It was a momentous time for Europe and for the United States, for the world. But in the fall of 1989, I was just beginning my teaching career as a newly minted PhD at Georgia State, just up the road. And on November the 9th, 1989, I was sitting in my office sometime in the late afternoon. Can't recall the exact time. And I got a phone call. And on the phone was CNN Radio. They had a radio station back then in Atlanta. I don't think they do anymore. But the person on the other end wanted to know my opinions, my views about what was going on in Berlin. And I had no idea. This is before the internet. There's no news flashes on your computer screen, no electronic newsletters, all of that. So I had to please ask for a half hour or so to try to find out what was going on, and then I'll call me back in a half hour. I'll give you my views. And right after that, I hung up. I went to the radio to try to find out what was going on over in Berlin. So it was a rather remarkable day. But we're talking about how the end of the Cold War, the opening of the Berlin Wall, affected the security situation in Europe, and we can go more broadly and say the world. Of course, the end of the Cold War resolved many of the one set of security problems. It ended the Cold War division of Europe. It ended the military standoff between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. It ended the threat of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, at least for them. But also, at the same time that it resolved a set of security problems, the opening of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, created a whole new set of issues and problems. One, of course, was what to do about Germany, the age-old German question, back again. The answer, as we now know, was unification, rather rapidly, on the basis of Article 23 of the Basic Law on October the 3rd, 1990. The alternative, of course, was Article 146, which would have required the wholesale rewriting of the German Constitution. But it was agreed that united Germany would be fully sovereign with the renunciation of remaining four-power occupation rights that was agreed to in September 1990, the so-called 2+4 treaty. Another key question, what to do about the 400,000 Soviet troops still in East Germany. And after negotiations, the decision was made that they would withdraw by 1994, along with the provision of quite a bit of German financial assistance to help make that happen. What to do about a united Germany and NATO? Well, it was eventually agreed that Germany would be allowed to remain a full member of NATO. Germany would, in turn, agree to reduce and limit the size of its armed forces to 370,000 troops, and to forswear nuclear weapons, the possession of nuclear weapons and biological and chemical weapons. What to do about the German-Polish border, which had been moved westwards as a result of the Second World War, and was still contested by some. Would this again become a source of conflict in Central Europe? Well, in November of 1990, the German and Polish governments agreed to a treaty recognizing the Oder-Neisse line as the final border between Germany and Poland. What to do about the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led military alliance? Well, by consensus, this was dissolved in July of 1991. What about the possibility of a new security order in Europe? Perhaps a new pan-European security order that would replace the two superpower blocs. Perhaps this would include even the Soviet Union, but not the United States. These ideas were bandied about and talked about quite a bit in the early days and months after the end of the Cold War. But after brief flirtation with such ideas, they were quickly abandoned, and an enlarged NATO became the dominant security organization for post-Cold War Europe. But what about NATO itself? What would its future be? Many people argued at the time that it was no longer needed. But eventually, NATO decided to pursue basically a two-track process of reform, one of which was enlargement. Beginning in 1999, with the addition of the first three Central and Eastern European new members, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, NATO continued to enlarge to its present number of 29, with the admission of Montenegro in 2017 being the most recent addition. And the second path pursued by NATO, in addition to enlargement, was to become an alliance that operated out of the European area. This was a demand of the United States in particular, which wanted NATO to basically go out of area or go out of business. The first operation out of area was the Bosnia air campaign in 1985. Then the bombing of Serbia on behalf of, in support of Kosovar Albanians in 1999. Then the missions in Afghanistan in 2003, Iraq in 2004, and most recently the NATO air campaign in Libya in 2011. What about the European community? Another key security organization in Europe. The European community also eventually adopted a two-pronged strategy of change, both deepening and widening. The deepening of integration took place primarily with the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, which created the European Union and which provided the provisions for European Monetary Union. The widening or enlargement began in 2004 with the so-called Big Bang enlargement, the admission of 10 new member states, including 8 Central and Eastern European countries. In 2007, the addition of Bulgaria and Romania, and in 2013, Croatia. The enlargements of both NATO and the European Union dealt with a couple of key questions. First of all, who will be in, who will be out, and how to prevent new divisions in Europe from emerging between prosperous, secure ins and less prosperous, insecure outs. Both organizations tried to deal with this issue without much success, I might add. NATO came up with a Partnership for Peace program in 1994. This was a program to provide for military cooperation with non-NATO members, perhaps as a preparation for their eventual membership. It also tried to build bridges with Russia through the Russia-NATO Founding Act in 1997, and then later the creation of the NATO-Russia Council in 2002. The European Union, for its part, came up with something called the European Neighbourhood Policy, or ENP, that would provide links to countries outside of the EU that did not have a formal prospect of membership and help to promote reforms in these countries. The ENP extended to not just Eastern European countries, but also to Southern Mediterranean countries. And then this was followed by the Eastern Partnership in 2009, which created special ties between the EU and 3 Eastern European and 3 South Caucasus countries. These efforts, however, were ultimately unsuccessful in avoiding new divisions in Europe, and instead the dividing line between NATO-EU ins and outs was simply pushed further to the east. So what have been the outcomes of all of this for European security? I think one key outcome that we see today is a resentful Russia with a strong sense of victimization and a determination to restore its influence and great power status. Another outcome is a new security vacuum in the post-Soviet Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and in the South Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. We also see frozen conflicts in these parts of Europe, conflicts by which Russia has tried to maintain a military presence, trying to destabilize countries in the region, maintain influence or leverage, and also to discourage the West from wanting to integrate them. But these frozen conflicts exist in Georgia, in South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, and in Moldova, in Transnistria, and now, of course, in eastern Ukraine. We also see, as an outcome, a reassertion of Russian military power in Georgia in 2008, and then Crimea and the Ukraine in 2014. And finally, and this is maybe a little bit more controversial, and it alludes to something that Milada Vachudova said in her keynote address, it's possible, and I'm not sure that I agree with this myself, but I want to put it out there, that the illiberalism and nationalist populism in Central and Eastern European member states is to some extent an outcome of the whole transplant of the Western liberal model, maybe more properly the neoliberal economic model, to unprepared societies in the top-down manner in which it was done. And this itself represents a security dilemma for Europe and the West. Finally, I want to conclude with, here again a bit more speculatively, some long-term indirect effects, perhaps, of the end of the Cold War, the opening of the Berlin Wall, which was a key part of that. And these are much more long-term effects and more indirect. And the two major geopolitical shocks, really, of the recent decades after the end of the Cold War itself have been 9/11 and the rise of China, right? And some of these, to some extent, can be traced perhaps somewhat. They can be viewed as aftershocks, perhaps, in some ways of the end of the Cold War. The first, 9/11, the end of the Cold War, of course, emboldened the fluid situation, the uncertainty at that time helped to embolden Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait in August of 1990. This provoked the United States-led military response, supported that. He agreed with George Bush's goal of creating the New World Order based on international law. And so the US-led military response was successful in pushing Saddam Hussein and Iraq out of Kuwait, but also resulted in the permanent stationing of US military forces in Saudi Arabia. This, of course, was viewed as a sacrilege by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, who made it a mission to punish the United States and the West for this, and ultimately led to the 9/11 attacks. A very indirect link, perhaps, to the end of the Cold War, but perhaps a link nonetheless. And finally, the rise of China. The end of the Cold War, one of its effects was really to open up the doors to globalization, as we came to know it in the 1990s and later. And for the first time, the Western capitalist economic order was extended fully around the world, not just half of the world taking part in that. And China took ample advantage of that to promote its own dynamic growth and rise, and as a result has become the great power that it is today. With globalization, which contributed to China's rise, that happened without the end of the Cold War, probably not. So I'll stop there with those rather speculative comments, and just reiterate that the end of the Cold War really had tremendous, profound effects for European security and global security, both immediate and also more long-term. And I'll turn it over to Max. Thank you.
Thank you very much Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a delight, and I'm glad that the Atlantic Council on International Relations could help co-sponsor this, and I'm so pleased to see so many from the Council still here for the talk. It's important, I think, as we look at this issue, for me to reflect back. My first time in Berlin was 12 days before, or 13 days before the wall went up. I was there as a cadet from the U.S. Air Force Academy. And it's also important to realize, and this was the map, incidentally, that we had at the time. And it's important to realize that Berlin is 100 miles inside of East Germany. And we had access through 3 corridors, and that's the way you got into Berlin. And when those corridors were cut, the way you had to go in was by air, and of course that's why we had the Berlin airlift. But what struck me, actually one of the things that was interesting was, of course, Nikita Khrushchev saw this little island called Berlin, West Berlin, as he put it, a bone stuck in the Soviet throat. And in many ways, it really was. Because when I went there in 1961, we had an opportunity to cross easily into East Berlin. I mean, we did all the standard things, went to Triktower Park to see the monument to the Soviet soldiers that had fallen during the invasion of Berlin. But what struck me most is we were 16 years after the end of the war. Western Germany had largely recovered. Western Berlin had largely recovered. But when we traveled into Eastern Berlin, it was amazing how little recovery had taken place. It was as I used to think about it, a drab, a dingy, and simply miserable place to be. There was some new construction, but there was still a lot of bombed out buildings. The new construction were mostly Soviet-style apartments on Stalin Alley, which have long since disappeared. There was no indication, even 12 days before the wall fell, that the wall was going to go up, fall, that the wall was going to go up. The official reason for the wall was that it was to keep Western fascists from entering the German Democratic Republic. But it really was the endless flow of refugees. This was a way to get to the West. You went into Berlin. In June, before the wall fell, 19,000 people crossed into Western Berlin from East Berlin. In July, 30,000. In the 12 days before the wall went up, in August, another, I think, 13,000 crossed into West Berlin. They were losing a huge number of their very talented people, teachers, engineers, doctors. So it was a very traumatic experience for them. And we could say that the wall, in effect, was an effective barrier. Those numbers decreased dramatically. Nevertheless, even while the wall was up, about 5,000 people managed to get through to West Berlin with losses in, as was mentioned earlier by the Consul General, in the 200 to 300 variety. The wall went up to keep the people from East Berlin from going into West Berlin. My wife visited in 1967. We were stationed in England. And she went along with the wives of 3 other pilots that were stationed in England with us. And their instruction was not to go into East Berlin. But she did. And so did the other 4. Wives pilots never do what their husbands tell them to do. At any rate, nothing much had changed. She didn't see the destruction anymore. But it was still that drab, dingy place. So the wall fell, perhaps for many reasons. But primarily it fell, in my view, because the system that the Soviet Union had imposed, not only on itself, but imposed on its eastern neighbors, was a failure. A lot of other reasons contributed, but you didn't have to be a rocket scientist in Eastern Europe and in Eastern Germany to see that things were really much better in the West. And of course, contributing to that were many factors, but I'd like to point to two. One big contributing factor was Ostpolitik, initiated by Egon Bahr and of course by the Chancellor Willy Brandt in 69 and 70. And second, the Conference on Security and Cooperation, which opened the borders for all sorts of information. Both those two acts made it clear to all the people in Eastern Germany and elsewhere in Eastern Europe that their system was a failure. For me, it was evident in my visit in 1961. It was evident throughout Eastern Europe by the time the wall went down. You know, there was a saying that and incidentally speaking about the wall, I should bring you a piece of the wall. That piece was given to me by Dan Papp sitting back there, who had visited shortly after the wall went down and got his own little chunk and gave me a piece of that wall. But it was quite evident that the system had been failing. When I visited the Soviet Union in 1977, it was clear to me that it wasn't just failing in Eastern Germany. It was failing throughout. I had visited the Soviet Union in 77. I had visited several other countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia at the time, as well as Germany once again, East Germany included. But what struck me when I went to the Soviet Union, here the central power of the Soviet bloc was you landed at the old Sheremetyevo airport. It was a dingy looking place. There were many aircraft sitting on the runway, none of them moving. They wouldn't allow the 747 in because it would embarrass them. And so we landed in one of the smaller aircraft. If you went into Moscow, the streets were empty. There were wide boulevards, but no traffic. We stayed at the fabled Russia Hotel right across from Red Square, with its restaurant on the 21st floor overlooking the Kremlin. Very romantic, very picturesque, windows very dirty, and the pillows in the room still smelled of the smoke from the fire that had taken place earlier in the Russia in 1977. This was a third world country with a first-rate military. The wall went down and the Cold War ended because we did exactly what George Kennan said. Stay true to your values. And there's a message, ladies and gentlemen, in today's world. The seeds of change clearly were in the air when, as the wall was coming down, following the deaths of Leonid Brezhnev in 76, Yuri Andropov in was 70 years old. In 84, Konstantin Chernenko followed him in 85. We had the rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev, a young guy. And I used to have on my wall a map of the Politburo and all the other senior bodies. And all of a sudden, this guy who's down here jumps up, young guy. And it was clear to him and to other people in the Soviet Union that they couldn't keep up with the West. In 1986, at the 27th Party Congress, he begins to speak about things called the dignity of man, political and social and personal rights, dialogue and cooperation. In 1988, he's already embarked on what they call perestroika, economic restructuring, glasnost, open sea and transparency, and novo myšlenia, or dialogue and cooperation. We in the West couldn't understand this, and we couldn't believe it. At that time, I was engaged in a major effort with the Atlantic Council of the United States in Washington, D.C., the project chaired by General Andy Goodpaster, former Supreme Allied Commander, and Walt Stessel, who happened to be the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, in trying to ascertain where to go. And we had an array of people from right to left, and there were intense arguments about this. But some of us felt Gorbachev was real. In December '88, he announced unilaterally a reduction of 500,000 troops, of Soviet troops. And in February '89, the last Soviet troops left Afghanistan. By mid-'89, Gorbachev seemed not only to be acquiescing to the changes that were taking place in Eastern Europe, but in fact encouraging them. Soviet Union warned the Czech leaders not to delay reform. Within 3 weeks of that warning, the Czech parliament voted to end the 40-year monopoly of the Communist Party. Then the bomb fell. Erich Honecker had been holding out against the line of reforms that were taking place elsewhere in Eastern Europe. The German government was always the strongest of supporters of the Soviet Union. We always used to think that they were out trying to out-Soviet the Soviet Union itself. However, during Gorbachev's visit to the 40th anniversary of the Warsaw Pact in 1989, in October of that year, he began to distance himself. While they greets him, with a big kiss at the airport, he begins to distance himself by Honecker by noting that life punishes harshly anyone left behind in politics. The word was clear, and within a few days, Honecker was out. The rest is, of course, is history. One by one, we saw free and democratic elections held in East Europe. In 1990, in July of 1990, 4 months after declaring German membership in NATO was absolutely out of the question, Gorbachev accepted a reunited Germany. And of course, on October 3rd, Germany was indeed reunited. Some will mark the end of the Cold War as 26 December 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved. I think in many ways the end of the Cold War happened when Germany was reunited. That was the real mark of the end of the Cold War. The security implications of all that were huge. As Michael has mentioned, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved in '91. With the demise of the Soviet Union, new opportunities for cooperation emerged. That same year, in 1991, the United States identified the need to expand defense and security contacts with the emerging democracies of Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia. In '92, Colin Powell endorsed a plan that be prepared for him by Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney, approved that plan to create an institution that would do just that, and that institution was called the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. And the objective of that center was to bring people from all of the Eastern European, Central European, and Caucasus, Central Asian countries, together with people from Western Europe, the United States, and Canada, to examine and grow a new security community. The idea was essentially to expand the footprint of cooperation that had begun with the transatlantic community into Central and Eastern Europe and Russia and Eurasia. While the initial objective was essentially to help these countries make the transformation from the communist type style governments to a democratic governance, and from planned economics to a market economy, it was clear within a few years that most of those countries thought they knew how to do democracy and market economies. And so the transition was complete in the late 1990s when we really got down to begin discussing complex security issues that confronted all the countries of Europe. And there were some very interesting sidelights to that. The sidelights were that at the very beginning, many of the people that came, particularly from Russia, were very skeptical and also unwilling to speak. They constantly asked for the answer. And we said in politics, there is no single answer. The answer is what we can agree on, and so we need to examine the issues as we see them from our perspective. And countries, as we had learned in the cooperation that took place in the Western transatlantic community, countries have different interests. Countries have different objectives. But you can, if you work hard enough, you can find common ground. And this was a very, very, I think, enlightening thing for many of the people that came to the Marshall Center. By 1998, the center had become a full-fledged security studies institution with courses for what we call leaders, captains and majors. As a matter of fact, Eliza Markley was one of the students that came from Romania as an officer in the Romanian army. We had courses for mid-grade people. These were courses that people came and stayed at the Marshall Center. For mid-grade people, from lieutenant colonels and colonels, and we had courses with very senior ministers and deputy ministers. The longest course was about 19 weeks, trimmed to 15 and subsequently even more. But these courses created a cadre of people that have gone back to these countries in Central and Eastern Europe and in Western Europe and created contacts and concepts that will serve, I think, all of the democratic countries very well. It's an understatement to say problems nevertheless remain. Many senior officers at the end of the Cold War on both sides were suspicious and mistrustful. For our part, I observed a number of senior officials who simply failed to grasp what I would say the opportunity of the hour. The idea that often permeated many of the people, senior people in Washington that I interacted with, was we won the Cold War and you lost it. And that meant that the Soviet Union simply had to get in line, or the new Russia had to get in line. This was, I think, a terrible way to deal with Russia. I think that it contributed to some of the misunderstandings that existed on both sides. Concerns, of course, further grew in March of '99. The Russians had their concerns as NATO expanded to include Poland, the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the same month the United States NATO started their bombing campaign in Belgrade. It was further exacerbated in 2008 with the, as mentioned, and Michael mentioned, the Russian-Georgian war, and of course we can go through a number of issues. The 2014 Little Green Men invasion of Crimea, the Russian clampdown on NGOs, Russian activity in the Arctic, their submarine activity in what we call the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, violations of the airspace in Baltic nations, continued support for separatism in Donetsk and Luhansk, Russian cyber activity, and interference in the elections in the West. All these seem to have put a nail in the coffin of cooperation. Given what we've heard today, given what already Michael has noted, and as well as what we heard in the main speeches, it is absolutely essential that we continue these kind of organizations like the Marshall Center. It is absolutely essential that we support NATO as an organization, those statements made about NATO are firm in our support, and I think that's even more important in light of what has happened recently in Syria with turning our backs on the Kurds. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to hearing Eliza.
Thank you very much for your presentations, both of you, and thank you for inviting me, Claire. I greatly appreciate that. I literally want to talk about two main points, but for that I need a very short introduction about myself. I need to make this short introduction about myself, but I promise I'll be short. I grew up in communist Romania, and I was 19 when the revolution happened. In Romania, I was therefore 19 years old when the Berlin Wall fell. November 9, 1989, passed by obviously with nothing on the news. November 10 passed by with nothing on the news. Here we are in December, and there's still nothing on the news. So what was happening critical in terms of changing the world a couple of hundred miles away from Bucharest was not known by the population of Romania. I also have to mention that in January 1989, I started my military training, and in August 1989 I was commissioned as an officer in the communist military of Romania. Of course, a completely different concept than what we know right now in terms of strategy, right? Communist countries, they had that, the fight of the entire people, right? So countries such as Romania, of 23 million people, had a military of about 400,000 people. Huge military. But here I am in August. I'm commissioned as a young military officer in Romania. I start working for the University of Bucharest. I was doing military training with women who were students. In all colleges, this was done. It was mandatory, just as it was mandatory for all young men to do their military service for either 6 months or 1 year. For us, for women, don't think that we were left out. They were training young people like myself to train college students. Once a month we would have military training and obviously indoctrination in communist propaganda. So again, November happens, December happens, and we know nothing. All communist countries were shielded from the informative perspective, right? All the information that was released was very, very strictly controlled before. I remember that around 17th of December, I received a phone call, and I was asked not to wear my military uniform on the street. And obviously, like any 19-year-old young woman, I asked why, and I was yelled at. Just do what you were told. It was actually a kind of a secret call. It wasn't announced in the entire military. But a friend of mine who had a higher position told me, do not wear your military uniform on the streets. And then the revolution started to happen in Bucharest, right? The reason that I was called and asked not to wear the military uniform was that the revolution actually started already in a western large city of Romania, Timișoara. 16th of December, we were again 100 miles away, and we knew nothing 4 days after in Bucharest. We, the military, the women in the military who were doing training with students, of course we were considered not very important, so we were actually called and kept at the University of Bucharest into some offices. We were literally kept there for several days while the revolution happened. And I remember watching, during night, that's when the fires would start, and all we knew was that something bad is happening. We knew that history is changing, but we didn't have details. In the morning of the 22nd of December, around 9:30 in the morning, the dictator Ceausescu came up with an announcement on TV. He said the following: the Ministry of National Defense was found guilty of treason, and he committed suicide. I have to mention that up to that date, between about 18 and 22nd of December, those bullets and fires that I was able to watch during the night, significant battles were carried. Romania was the only country that had to go through a bloody revolution to change the system. More than 1,000 people died. There are accounts that military actually reacted, and people died not only because of military forces' reaction, but also mostly because of security, the communist Securitate reaction. With that announcement in the morning of 22nd December 1989, that the Ministry of National Defense was found guilty of treason, instantly all over the country, the military in the armed forces, they turned their arms and they fraternized with the population. This is a unique moment. I haven't heard of something similar happening in any other countries. You would wonder why. Because it was literally instantaneous. The explanation that I came up with, reading a lot and trying to figure out why is it that this happened. There's a special bond, right, that occurs in the military. And also from people that I talked to afterwards, they told me, we just knew this was a lie. They just knew instantly. Another explanation is that in the history of Romania, throughout different regimes, military had for decades and centuries one of the highest level of trust of the population. Highest, obviously, than the government, higher than any other institution. It's actually the church, and today it's a similar situation. The church and the military have the highest level of trust in Romania. So I'm thinking that one of the reasons is this, that instantly, the revolution now it's happening not only with the civilian people demonstrating against the government, but with military demonstrating the government. This was the moment when revolution started to succeed in Romania. The same day, 22nd of December, the dictator fled the country. And from there, it's all history. Romania now is a democratic country. However, the transition, this is one point that I wanted to talk about. How is it that the fall of Berlin Wall was received in Romania? We learned about it probably end of December, January. That actually we were not the only one doing this. We just found out that we were actually one piece of the domino that had to happen. But because Romania experienced one of the most totalitarian regimes in the communist countries, Fortunately, it had to happen with a lot of bloodshed. Now I know the time is very short. What followed for the Romanian military is literally a change from how do you go from Warsaw Pact to NATO. And I had several points that I wanted to emphasize here, but I will just stop at one. And that is joining of NATO. Ever since I started to teach about international affairs and transition from communism to whatever came after, different regimes in different countries, there was always this discussion about the mistake that NATO did to extend to the East. And I agree with the academic points that, and even political points that maybe from the NATO's perspective, this was not the smartest and thing to do right after the fall of communism. But I usually make a point in reminding my students, of course you're not my students, but I want to make a point about the fact that the strong request from Romania's behalf, for instance, to be received in NATO was not necessarily because we were afraid of Russia or still Soviet Union in 1990 at the beginning. It wasn't because we wanted to be part of something bigger. It was literally, for us, it was a matter of identity. Romania is an island is a Latin island in a Slavic world. We always considered ourselves a European country. And for us, for Romanians, and this is the case for other countries as well, I don't think we would have stopped ever asking about being received and accepted in NATO and the EU if there was any rejection from these two organizations and institutions. It was a matter of identity for us. Again, it wasn't the political purpose, it was who we were. We always identified ourselves with European countries. And again, I think this is sometimes forgotten in the whole discussion of, where we are today politically in terms of, NATO and, versus Russia. So I want you to know that it was really coming from the people. This request was the request, the demand, the cry of the people to be given the identity that was taken away for almost 50 years by being somehow taken under the wing of Soviet Union. And I'll stop here because I know it's very late. Thank you very much.
That concludes our program for today. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to our panelists.